Dr. Sneha. It's a great pleasure for me to present to you some political development just occurring right now in the European Union on consent legislation. And you might ask, why do we look at the EU specifically, and what is the relevance for the WMA work looking at EU legislation in this kind of area? Well, doing data protection framework regulation in the EU always affects so-called third countries. And that you need to, in collaboration with the EU, you need to secure an adequate level of protection. So that is one issue. The other issue is that the EU has established a digital agenda. And this agenda foresees until 2020, amongst many other things, to reinforce international research cooperation, and that is specifically in the clinical trials area. So in looking at this EU reform package, and the specific points in their consent, presents also questions to the work group of the WMA. What I'm going to do is first of all present to you some consent elements and its implementation into law, followed by some consent legislation in healthcare and research. And I won't elaborate on the Council of Europe conventions or the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's just a very brief sketch in the area. And then I follow by giving a very brief sketch also in the data protection area on data protection laws in the EU. And then I present the most important issue in the EU, which is the most important issue for WMA, which is implemented in the General Data Protection Regulation right now, which foresees certain changes for consent legislation. Followed by an outlook for WMA and the questions we need to answer in the work group. So let's start with consent. Generally, a legally valid consent consists of three elements. It's given by a competent person. It is given voluntary without undue pressure. It is an adequately informed consent, also including full information, full disclosure of information to the person consenting, also making sure that he is fully understood. And I know, Amos, you have published extensively on that. You talk about 4 elements of consent, but I think to cover it broadly here with these 3 is also to make a brief summary of the 3 most important elements. Now, these 3 important elements can be legally implemented mostly in 4 ways. We have models of so-called express consent regimes. Express consent is used in EU data protection law. Express consent means you give an oral or an express or a written consent or an affirmative action like ticking a box. This is also in medical treatments. When you go into medical treatment, get a medical intervention, you give express informed consent. Another way to implement consent is via so-called presumed consent regimes. And I think in the US, data protection laws pretty much rely on presumed consent regimes. Also, organ transplantation laws in the EU rely on presumed consent, some of them, like in Spain or Austria. You're presumed to consent unless you opt out. Then we have new models like broad, dynamic, or one-time consent. And proponents for these types of consent mostly come from biobank research, and which means, to put it very shortly, once you cast a consent, you also give it for future purposes you're not aware at the time you're consenting. So it's for future purposes, sort of a carte blanche solution. Open consent is very new. It was developed by the Personal Genome Project by Harvard, also by the UK and Canada. It collects pieces of DNA in a sort of open access data bank. And it poses a problem in terms of traceability. Because though the data are pseudonymized, since it's about DNA sequences, it's always traceable. And being aware of this kind of problem, the ethical principle of consenting was reversed in that it was said, you can give your open consent, being aware that for any kind of risk you just don't know. And it's sort of a reverse principle of consenting. And of course you can ask yourself, is that a permissible way of approaching the issue? Because you pretty much give up your right to self-determination. Being aware you give it up. For the letter 3, you might ask, is this really a true informed consent? And there's lots of discussion going on about this. Now, as a bottom line, the law which expresses notions of consent embodies the right to self-determination coming from the principle of autonomy. Everybody has a right to have his autonomy respected and therefore has a right to self-determination. And WMA policy suggests that informed consent best accommodates the right to self-determination. When you look at 4 important policies like the Declaration of Lisbon, which covers patients' rights, International Code of Medical Ethics, which covers physicians' duties, when you look at the Declaration of Helsinki, which covers research, when you look at the Declaration of Venice, which covers end-of-life decision-making, they all are based on informed consent. Now, proponents of the new models, these new models, I go back, broad, dynamic, or one-time, or open consent, they argue that informed consent comes from the traditional patient-doctor relationship, and it has extended from the medical clinical trials area to a somewhat biomedical, biological research area, which is a shift from a physical dimension to an individual privacy dimension. And therefore, the focus is on individual privacy only. So when we go to the physical dimension, the treatment-research relationship and consent legislation in this area, a normal physical intervention always requires informed consent, usually by a contract. This is in many jurisdictions like that. You have it in your civil codes, you have specific treatment contract legislation on that. It differs variably, however, sort of a contract is necessary. This is pretty much agreed. But in addition, you have specific laws specifically requiring informed consent, as you, for example, have in clinical trials in Europe, or in medical devices legislation. They all require informed consent. However, when it comes to a sort of secondary use of data collected within this treatment research relation, you might get a problem as soon as you want to use these kind of collected data within the treatment relation for other purposes, for example, for research purposes. And the person having consented, this consent doesn't cover it. So then you might face a problem. Not only a problem in terms of healthcare consent law, but also in terms of data protection consent law. This is where we get to the individual privacy dimension. This is data protection law. In the EU, data processing requires express and informed consent via contract, mostly via contract, so-called data processing contracts. Sometimes you'll not really notice it because sometimes it's automatically done, but sometimes you have these kind of contracts. In addition, data processing requires consent as stipulated by data protection laws. We have an EU data protection directive since 1995, and it's all implemented on national level. And this requires express and informed consent. And of course, even at the time of 1995, it was acknowledged that there are certain situations which need certain attention, like research, and they established a so-called research privilege at that time as well. And they said, for example, you could use data collected, store it longer, or use it as soon as you anonymize it, or at least pseudonymize it, and you find technical solution to work with these kind of data. And only in very few circumstances when this is not possible to gain consent, informed consent from the person affected, then you need to establish national safeguards, and this is what you've done. You talked about this morning, for example, in Iceland, that you set up research ethics review boards, research ethics committees, that you involve your data protection officer. They have a look at what's going to happen to these kind of data. However, again, a secondary use of data, also in the data protection law context, without the consent you actually have given to as the person affected, and without a new consent, poses a problem. Now, what does the EU suggest now? We have a general data protection regulation as a draft by the European Commission. Usually the legislative process is always that the initiator of legislative proposals comes from the European Commission, and that was done in winter 2012. And the Commission proposal pretty much said, as a rule, possibly you can't read it, it's down here, Bodies conducting historical and so forth scientific research may publish or otherwise publicly disclose personal data only if the data subject has given consent. In an earlier provision in this suggested draft proposal, they define consent as it used to be since 1995 as express and informed consent. In addition, of course, they acknowledge that there needs to be certain privileges for research, and this is why they filled in here in letter A and letter B, as a rule, please use anonymization wherever possible, or at least pseudonymization for further data processing. Again, they acknowledge also in this Commission proposal, it's not on the screen here, that there might be situations where this is not possible, but then they rely on certain rules like the safeguards we talked about, ethics committees and data protection officers. Now, what does it mean? Primary and secondary use of identifiable data is not possible without express consent as a general rule. But, in view of the principles of, and this is a data protection law principles in the EU, in view of the principle of data minimization and purpose limitation, you can use anonymization and pseudonymization techniques. Now, being in this legislative process, it's not only the Commission who deals with this, it's also the European Parliament. And the European Parliament always chooses a committee in charge of a proposal by the European Commission, and they have to draft a report. In this report, they make amendments to the Commission proposal, where they say what is right or wrong and what they want to be changed. And there was a first committee proposal last year by the committee in charge in the European Parliament. What they suggested was, where the data subject's consent is required, a one-time consent is sufficient for the processing of medical data, exclusively for public health purposes of epidemiological, translational, and clinical research. So a one-time consent. So what does it mean? Primary and secondary use of identifiable data is possible without a true informed consent, if I refer back to my initial wording. And the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation are not addressed here. What about the techniques of anonymization and pseudonymization? Now, since this was very controversial in the committee of the European Parliament, they need to come up, before the vote on this report, they need to come up with a compromise. And the compromise, as it stands now, reads, where the data subject's consent is required for the processing of medical data exclusively for public health purposes or scientific research, the consent may be given for one or more specific and similar researches. So what does that mean? From a legal point of view, this is very ambiguous. It's not really clear. Do they mean with similar researches nothing different than one-time consent? Is it just the same like this one, like one time? Or is it something different? Well, the discussion is not finished here. What does it mean? Possible primary and secondary use of identifiable data is possible without true informed consent. We don't really know yet, since the wording is just not clear here. Again, in view of the data protection principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, what about, first of all, looking at technical solutions, anonymization and pseudonymization? What is the state of play? We talked to people in the General Directorate Justice, which is one of the departments of the European Commission, being in charge of this Commission proposal. And actually they favour keeping data protection separate from healthcare and research and medical research. They want to keep the data protection consent as it is, as a rule, as an express and informed consent. And they want to keep it separately from the consent regime in healthcare. And also they think they should invest into technical solutions. They think, in view of data minimization and purpose limitation, better concepts of pseudonymization should be developed. However, European Parliament appears to favour something different. They appear to favour new models of consent schemes, as I've just shown, and they want to introduce these new models of consent via data protection laws. So they want to shift questions away from the physical dimension to the individual privacy dimension, and therefore shifting it away from physicians' responsibilities, and possibly shifting it away from medical ethics. So when you look at it further down, they shift the question of consent further from the medical area just to the data protection area, which poses certain questions for the World Medical Association to principal questions. Do we stay with informed consent as a core principle, plus better technical safeguards, for example, better pseudonymization as suggested by the European Commission or the Director General of Justice, and governance solutions for very few exceptions, as you explained them earlier, Dr. Klaver? Or do we accept models of broad, dynamic, or one-time consent as a new principle right from the beginning for data processing and research? However, these are, as just shown, possibly incompatible with true informed consent. And going further, this leads to two questions for the work group to answer when you look at the outlook. Is there a need to rethink informed consent and research towards another valid consent pending? What kind of data do we deal with? You talked about it. Do we talk about epidemiological data, biobank data, or genetic sequencing? The database quality, and also interlinkage possibilities. And what kind of technical governance solutions and involvement of supervisory institutions are in place we could look at? And having had a look at this first question, the second question then reads, is there a desire to amend Article 23 and 24 of the draft policy, which is circulated, and which are DOH compliant? So I think it is wise that we discuss first these two issues in order to answer these two questions for the work group. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, well, this is from the European level and European politicians, and they usually don't clarify things very much. Do you have questions to Annabel?
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
I have two questions. Number one, I mean, we have seen in this discussion now on the European level that there is a strong push from the research organizations to basically go to a broad consent for secondary use purpose. Would you share this notion that if you open the secondary use quite open, then this gives a very easy way to circumvent informed consent in the first place? Because what you do is you
always use the secondary use
yes.
for any kind of research because it makes it easier, actually.
So
you never need to ask for a specific purpose, so it
yeah.
appears to be easier always to ask for a variety of purposes where you can bluntly consent.
So it's nothing else than a cheap trick to circumvent.
Yeah, that's why I said for primary use and secondary use,
yeah, okay.
It doesn't appear to be true informed consent.
So actually, if you believe in informed consent, this never goes together. It just doesn't work. Because you always then can circumvent informed consent for the first one by using the real first one as a second one, as a second purpose.
Yeah, it depends how you address it, yeah. What kind of term you use.
But you can do that.
Well, we see in practice.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can imagine you have a backdoor then which is wide open and you can forget informed consent because you pretend something as your first line of research, which is easygoing and everybody will accept, but if you have something in mind where people would not consent, you just put it in second place, and then you just have the data collected, and then say, oh, I have a second purpose here, and there has been a broad consent given, so I can abuse that. I think that is something we would see, and the safeguards have to be in place. The other question is more a theoretical one, but maybe an interesting one. When it comes to the one-time consent, which is the personal genome project.
Open consent.
The open consent, yes. In the personal genome consent, where you basically have to agree that the data you give can be used for each and any purposes, and you have to sign that you understand that it can have grave consequences for yourself, which means you purposely give up your self-determination in that. Now, we have heard from Robert already, we do understand there may be patients who are in an end-stage disease who may be willing to do everything because they have a hope. Although we as doctors, I think we have to be fair with that and tell them how big the chances really are that they will get a result from that. And as we know, they are pretty close to zero, at least for the individuals. But then the question is this autonomy which we have, is this part of our dignity? And if it is part of our dignity, is it an inalienable right which we cannot give up?
I I guess that differs also from society to society, what they think is belongs to the human dignity. Some define it different than others do. We'll see, and I already read articles about criticizing this PGP project, Personal Genome Project, and their approach to consent, in that legally, also legally and ethically, it's highly contested whether you can really reverse the approach. So coming from the legal area, coming from Germany, I would doubt we could go this far. We had this kind of rulings in other contexts, and they were far less dangerous.
Okay.
So my question really follows well in this idea of different societies setting different standards. Because in the European Union, what we're talking about is different societies with different standards agreeing on a common standard. And on the slides you presented, it looks like there's a bit push back and forth, that people are trying to move this line and find a common line that would work for the entire union. What's the representation like in these working groups? So are all nations represented? So all of the societies that are taking part, are they all represented? Are they all at the table, or are these smaller groups? So who is pushing this line back and forth, and using what
That's
methods?
a very good question. Depends on the stage you're in the legislative process. In the beginning, it's the European Commission. They call themselves neutral and just making a proposition, what they think should be done, what is right, and how legislative work could be done. Then European Parliament comes into play. There, of course, you have political parties' representation by country. So this can be any kind of representation. Also, there is access to parliamentarians, and we've seen specifically in the Tobacco Directive proposal, as you remember, Dr. Fierste, there was a large access by lobby groups to parliamentarians. So this is a problem in itself, of course. This is how it is. Of course, it's also part of opinion making that you hear different opinions also from lobby groups, but this is what's happening also on parliamentary level. And then is when member states come into play. These are represented by our ministries when they negotiate proposals, when they come to a conclusion. So this is just a normal representation.
A last question?
Yeah, I want to ask about a thing that we actually didn't cover, and I'm interested in hearing about how long you can store data. For it seems with the biobanks you can store them forever, and and the data associated with a biological sample you can store within that biobank. But if you don't have biological samples and you're doing a study on a patient, here in Iceland they are fairly strict that you're only supposed to store the data as long as the study is going on.
Yeah, for the purpose of the study. That's the principle of purpose limitation. It's always limited to the purpose it's actually collected for. Of course, you also, in medical treatment context, you have legal obligations by the physicians to store patient data records for, as a general rule, let's say 10 years, in certain circumstances for many more years. In terms of data protection, it might be different, and in terms of research, it might be different as well, pending the specific legislation you have in force. When you say in Iceland you have and you always have, above all, this principle of purpose limitation. So when there is no purpose for storage, why should you store it?
Okay.
Well,
Thank you very much.
why should you throw it away? I mean, there's a lot of value in the data.
Yeah, this is why it's one of the challenges.
We have to continue. Thank you very much for the very good dialogue. We have next